The Silverado sat abandoned on the shoulder of US 72, its engine silent, but the radio still clawing at the night with distorted rock music. The air was thick, Alabama in July, heat rising off the asphalt like a living thing. Yet beneath that suffocating warmth ran a colder truth. 2 young lives had just vanished. Inside the cab, investigators would later find a folded road map, its paper soft with sweat, a red circle scrawled over O'Neill Bridge like a premonition. On the passenger seat, a single smear of blood, thin, almost dismissible, yet louder than any scream. At the floorboard lay a woman's shoe, its lace tugged loose, abandoned in haste. And then there was the message. At 12:30 a.m. Jessica Monroe's phone pushed out a final text to her best friend. "Someone's following us." That cry for help never reached its destination, trapped midair like a ghost signal. Minutes later, Jessica and Daniel Whitaker dissolved into the blackness, swallowed whole by a stretch of highway most people drove without a second thought. You think you know fear until you're staring at an empty truck, its windows cracked, its music howling like a warning no one heeded. You think you understand danger until you realize every trace of them stopped here, and here alone. By morning, the Tennessee River burned beneath a merciless sun, while search dogs barked against currents that told no secrets. A green canvas bag surfaced, soaked and heavy, its pages of handwritten lyrics smeared into silence. It was enough to prove one thing. Jessica and Daniel had not simply walked away. Someone had erased them. And for 13 long years, Florence, Alabama would carry that wound. Stay with us, subscribe, hit the bell, and help keep these cold case files alive. Because the more we look, the louder justice becomes. The Tennessee River Music Festival was still alive when Jessica Monroe lifted her Polaroid camera one last time. The July air clung to every movement, thick with the smell of fried food and river mud, and the distant thump of bass drums rattled against her chest. The girl had always loved freezing moments, catching laughter in instant prints that she tucked into notebooks or left on her bedroom walls. That night, as fireworks sketched white veins across the sky, Jessica's smile flickered in the flash, youth captured just before the dark began swallowing the stage lights. Beside her, Daniel Whitaker adjusted the strap of his watch and steadied his posture like he always did before driving. At 20, Daniel carried himself with the quiet responsibility of someone who took pride in ordinary things. His classes at the University of North Alabama, the Silverado he had spent months polishing, the way Jessica trusted him to get her home safe. Friends noticed him pause, waving briefly before guiding Jessica toward the lot, where his truck gleamed under halogen lamps. To most, it was the kind of summer night that should have ended with tired laughter and stories shared until sunrise. But the line between routine and rupture is always thinner than anyone realizes. They slid into the Silverado, Jessica tossing her green backpack to the floorboard, still clutching the Polaroid camera like a talisman. Daniel turned the key, and the engine hummed with a mechanical confidence. He turned up the radio, an old habit of his. Music was armor. Noise was control. You're in that passenger seat now. The bass rattles your bones, almost drowning out the crickets outside. The highway stretches ahead like a black ribbon with no edge, and every chorus blasting from the speakers convinces you nothing bad could ever reach this bubble. That is how danger feels before it introduces itself. Like background static you dismiss because the song is louder. Psychologists call it optimism bias, the cognitive tilt that makes young people believe bad things happen to others, not them. After the high of a festival, after the fireworks and the lights, your brain smooths over every jagged possibility. Jessica and Daniel were riding a wave of that bias. They had arguments in the past, normal teenage struggles, but nothing that prepared them for the sudden presence of a stranger's headlights in the mirror. As the Silverado rolled onto US 72, the night thinned into silence except for the radio. Daniel rested his hand lightly on the steering wheel, tapping to the beat. Jessica fiddled with her phone, her face lit faintly in blue. Every gesture was casual, practiced, two kids moving through the familiar script of getting home late. Behind them, though, a pair of red taillights flickered in and out of sight, like eyes refusing to blink. A witness, a truck driver hauling freight toward Huntsville, would later recall the Bronco, older model, red paint dulled with age, sliding in and out of the Silverado's slipstream. He couldn't place the license plate, just remembered the glow of headlights sticking too close, too long. In memory, such details warp, but the sensation of wrongness lingers. Jessica's Polaroid rested against her lap, unexposed film still inside. She liked to capture people in candid frames, Daniel grinning at the wheel, or the streak of neon signs blurring past the windows. But that night, she didn't lift the camera. She typed a message instead. Her fingers trembled just enough to distort the letters. "Someone's following us." The text froze in the network like a cry trapped underwater. No one knew whether it reached its destination or not. What mattered was that she had felt it, that tremor in the gut that tells you the optimism bias is wrong, that your story might not bend toward the safe ending you assumed. You grip the armrest in that seat. The song on the radio is suddenly too loud, its lyrics absurd against the silence between headlights. You want to turn and check the rearview mirror, but you don't. Because admitting there's danger feels like inviting it closer. Daniel adjusted his mirrors. He was proud of his Silverado and protective of Jessica, but he wasn't reckless. He told himself it was just another driver, maybe leaving the festival, maybe taking the same route by coincidence. The rationalizations poured in. People rarely believe they're being hunted until the chase is undeniable. This is how predators exploit bias. The Bronco hung back, then edged forward. Sometimes its headlights widened, flooding the Silverado with glare. Then it slipped into the dark again. Jessica's phone remained open in her lap. Her thumb hovered, debating another message. The radio blared, some rock anthem about freedom, volume high enough to bury her pulse. The highway cut through the trees, no street lamps, only moonlight fractured by branches. It was the kind of road where time lost shape. Daniel's fingers tightened on the wheel. He told himself not to overreact. He had fought once before with Jessica's ex-boyfriend, Ethan Cole, and knew how fast jealousy could color suspicion. He wasn't going to accuse a random driver of malice without proof. But suspicion doesn't need proof to be correct. The Silverado reached a curve near O'Neill Bridge. Daniel downshifted, headlights sweeping over reflective road signs. For a moment, the Bronco disappeared from the mirror. Relief surged until the glow returned, closer this time, hugging the bumper like a shadow trying to crawl inside. You can almost feel the breath on your neck. Every nerve insists it's real, but the mind still whispers excuses. Maybe it's nothing. Maybe you're imagining it. That's optimism bias again, dulling the edges just when you need them sharp. Jessica clutched her backpack now. Daniel muttered under his breath, words lost in the static of the radio. The Silverado hummed forward, but the rhythm of safety had already broken. Later, friends would replay their last glimpse. Daniel's wave, Jessica's camera dangling, two young people stepping into the dark with no reason to suspect they wouldn't step out again. No one imagined that, within an hour, the Silverado would be found abandoned, radio still shrieking, map folded open, a shoe left like a signature of violence. The red Bronco, meanwhile, would slip from witness memory into rumor, then vanish from police files as if it never existed. And that is the cruelty of memory and bias. What begins as a hunch, a trembling thumb on a phone screen, becomes the very detail erased when the story is written down. The night of July the 14th, 2007, ended not with laughter, but with a silence Florence, Alabama still cannot shake. Abduction or panic? What's your first instinct? Comment below. If you think this part of the story hit hard, drop a 1 in the comments. If not, leave a 0. Your voice helps us keep these cold case files alive. The Silverado did not make it home. By 1. Iuzuru A. M. A state trooper driving along US 72 noticed the truck pulled onto the shoulder, hazard lights off, engine cooled, radio still blasting incoherently into the night. At first glance, it might have looked like fatigue, young drivers pulling over after a long concert. But as the trooper's flashlight swept through the cab, the image stiffened into something colder. The driver's side window bore a spiderweb crack, as though struck with sudden force. A smear of blood stained the passenger seat, so faint it could be overlooked, yet when the light caught it, the crimson glow told a story. On the floor, half under the seat, a woman's sneaker sat lopsided, its lace pulled loose, the kind of detail that makes silence roar louder than sound. Jessica's green backpack was gone. Her Polaroid, too. All that remained was the folded map on the dashboard, the circle drawn in red around O'Neill Bridge, a place the couple had never mentioned to friends. In isolation, each clue whispered. Together, they screamed. You're standing at the roadside now. The heat is still clinging to your shirt, sweat beading along your neck. Cicadas rasp endlessly from the tree line. And yet, the loudest thing is the Silverado itself, its open window leaking noise into a night that refuses to explain what happened here. Within hours, word reached both families. Daniel's father drove out immediately, his headlights cutting the same path his son had taken hours before. When he saw the Silverado on the shoulder, cordoned by police tape, his rage cracked the humid night. He stormed into the station, slamming his hand against the desk. He would never leave without telling me. Something happened. Beside him, Jessica's mother clutched a graduation photo, her voice trembling into pleas. Every second that passes is my daughter's life. Eights. But the officers on duty shook their heads, insisting the teens could have wandered, that they might return by morning. That dismissal would prove to be one of the investigation's most damaging errors. In missing person cases, investigators often speak of the golden window. The first 24 hours are critical, decisive, unforgiving. During that period, evidence remains fresh, memory sharp, and the trail warm enough to follow. Every hour lost is like sand slipping through a fist. By daylight, tire impressions fade, scents scatter in the wind, witnesses second-guess what they saw. Here, that window began to close the moment the Silverado was discovered. When daylight broke on July 15th, Florence, Alabama seemed to stir as a single organism. Over 300 people poured into the effort. Police officers, volunteer firefighters, neighbors, strangers who'd heard the call. The parking lot near O'Neill Bridge filled with vehicles, squad cars, pickup trucks, base boats hitched to trailers. Along the river's edge, K9 handlers tightened leashes as German shepherds strained forward, barking into the thick reeds. The search became an orchestra of noise. The whine of motors as boats cut through muddy water, the shouts of coordinators dividing crews into grids, the rhythmic pant of dogs sniffing tire ruts along the shoulder. For a moment, hope surged. The dogs locked onto a scent trail leading from the Silverado down toward the water. Handlers urged the animals forward, voices sharp with command. But just yards from the riverbank, the trail dissolved. The dogs circled, whining, claws scuffing dirt, then sat back on their haunches as if bewildered. The handler's words chilled everyone within earshot. The scent just cuts off, like they were lifted into a vehicle or taken onto a boat. Eights. Eyes turned instinctively to the Tennessee River. Its surface was deceptively calm, brown currents hiding unknown depths. Search boats deployed divers into the murk, bubbles rising as black figures slipped beneath. Families stood at the bank, clutching one another, watching for anything, any sign. By noon, the July sun had become merciless. Volunteers' shirts clung with sweat, brows streaked with grime. Then, a cry broke the monotony. A diver surfaced, one arm raised high. In his grip hung a sodden green handbag, water dripping in heavy, hollow notes onto the deck. Jessica's mother recognized it instantly, her daughter's bag, canvas fabric swollen and colorless from the river. When it was opened, no phone or wallet remained. Only a notebook, pages warped and smeared with ink, lyrics of songs Jessica had loved still faintly legible between stains. The fine, shattered illusions of a runaway. Someone had discarded it. Someone had wanted evidence erased. Jessica's mother pressed the wet notebook to her chest, sobbing. She'd never abandon these words. Eights. Around them, silence spread, an unspoken acknowledgement that the search had turned darker. The hours passed, each bringing less clarity. A middle-aged man came forward, reporting he'd seen an old red Bronco tailing a Silverado that night, its taillights glaring in the dark. He promised he'd glimpsed a license plate, swore he would bring the details the next morning. For a brief instant, investigators imagined a lead strong enough to cut through fog. But when pressed days later, the man recanted. "I'm not sure anymore. Maybe I got it wrong." Fear or pressure had choked his certainty. His silence became another hole in the record, another stone dragged into the river of doubt. As afternoon bled into evening, volunteers returned exhausted. Boats docked, engines sputtering quiet. The evidence table now held little more than Jessica's waterlogged bag, the folded map, and a shoe too light to anchor answers. Families sat slumped by the riverbank, eyes hollow. The sun fell crimson over the water, casting the whole search in the color of blood. And still, the official response remained tepid. Officers spoke of teenagers wandering, of jealous ex-boyfriends, of possibilities less frightening than the truth standing before them. By the time dusk sealed July 15th, the golden 24-hour window had slammed shut. Whatever trail Jessica and Daniel left had scattered into heat, water, and rumor. You're there at the edge of the scene. The air buzzes with insects. The Silverado hums its broken song, and somewhere across the water, a Bronco engine might still echo in the night. You realize the silence is permanent now, the kind that locks itself into memory, refusing to let go. The case that could have begun with precision instead drifted into speculation. And with every hour lost, the darkness grew thicker. The community's patience frayed quickly. In small towns, grief often turns into whispers, and whispers into accusations. Florence wasn't immune. With Jessica and Daniel gone, a void opened, and into that void, suspicion rushed like a flood. The police did not have much. An abandoned Silverado, a blood smear, a shoe, a waterlogged handbag, and a vanishing Bronco witness. But they did have a familiar name, Ethan Cole. Ethan was Jessica's ex-boyfriend, 20 years old, with a reputation that leaned half toward heartbreak, half toward hot-headedness. He had dated Jessica for nearly a year, their romance burning fast and bright through senior year. Friends remembered fights that flared in public, arguments over jealousy, even a shoving match once in the school parking lot. By the time Jessica left for graduation, she had moved on, so Daniel Whitaker was the quiet opposite. Steady, calm, respectful. That contrast made Ethan an easy target. On July 17th, 3 days after the disappearance, police officers knocked on his door. Neighbors peered through curtains as Ethan was led away in handcuffs, confusion etched on his face. His blue sedan sat parked nearby, and investigators swarmed over it with flashlights and kits, cameras clicking as if to immortalize guilt. What they found electrified Florence. Long scratches running across the car's side, jagged as though from a collision. By noon, local newspapers ran with the headline in bold type: "Ex-boyfriend under suspicion." News anchors spoke in stern tones about a possible crime of passion. People at diners lowered their voices, muttering that jealousy explained everything. For a community starved for clarity, Ethan fit neatly into the role of villain. You imagine it now. You're scrolling headlines, sipping your morning coffee, and there it is, a young man's face plastered under prime suspect. Do you feel certainty or doubt? Do you question the evidence, or does your mind settle into the comfort of an easy narrative? This is where psychology begins to shape justice. Investigators, reporters, and neighbors alike fell prey to confirmation bias, the tendency to latch onto information that confirms an existing belief while ignoring or downplaying what doesn't. Ethan had quarreled with Jessica. He had scars on his car. His anger was known. The puzzle seemed to assemble itself. Yet, confirmation bias is a dangerous lens. It blinds not only to alternative explanations, but to the raw detail of evidence. In Ethan's case, that blindness cracked almost immediately. Forensic analysts compared the paint from Ethan's scratched sedan to the fragment left on Daniel's cracked Silverado window. The results were blunt. No match. Scratches happen on cars in parking lots, at curbsides, in daily life, but the science demanded precision. And this wasn't it. Next came DNA. Technicians swabbed the passenger seat blood smear, hoping for a clear strike. The sample was compared against Ethan's profile. Again, negative. No trace of him lingered inside Daniel's truck. For 2 days, Ethan sat under harsh light in the interrogation room. He insisted he had been home playing video games with 2 friends, who corroborated his alibi. When asked about Jessica, his voice cracked, not with rage, but grief. "I still care about her," he whispered. "But I'd never hurt her." "Eights." The police pressed. He pushed back. In the end, the science outweighed suspicion. On July 19th, after 48 hours in custody, Ethan Cole was released. The release rippled through Florence like a lightning strike. Those who had already convicted him in their minds were stunned, even angry. Headlines pivoted overnight. Ex-boyfriend cleared. Images showed Ethan leaving the station, eyes downcast, jaw tight, the glare of cameras painting him less as a murderer than as a young man chewed up by rumor. For Jessica's family, the relief was hollow. Amanda Monroe, her sister, appeared on local television, her words sharp with fury. "Every second they waste on the wrong lead is another second my sister is gone. Someone out there is hiding. And it isn't Ethan." "Yes." Daniel's father erupted in meetings with investigators, slamming his fist on tables, veins standing out in his neck. "Stop chasing ghosts of jealousy. Look at the evidence. Look at that Bronco." Eights. But confirmation bias is sticky. Once the narrative took hold, many clung to it, unwilling to let go even after science shattered it. That's the danger. People prefer a story that feels simple, jealous ex-boyfriend, crime of passion, over the murky complexity of an unknown predator in the night. The psychology runs deeper still. In communities under stress, the collective mind seeks order. Blaming Ethan gave Florence a temporary sense of control. If jealousy explained it, then the threat was personal, localized, contained. To admit otherwise, to admit that a stranger in a Bronco could abduct two people at random, was to admit chaos. And chaos terrifies. So even as Ethan walked free, some whispered behind his back at the supermarket, at the gas station, in church pews. His face, once familiar, became the mask of suspicion. That stigma clung for years, long after forensic results had cleared his name. The Monroe and Whitaker families, however, had no luxury of clinging to easy narratives. For them, every misstep was agony. Jessica's mother wept on camera, her voice trembling. "My daughter is out there somewhere, and they're wasting time on the wrong boy." 8. By late July, the case had already drifted from fragile hope into bitter frustration. The Bronco lead evaporated, the ex-boyfriend cleared, and the police seemed adrift. But the Silverado remained. The blood smear did not vanish. The map circled in red still waited for an explanation. And so, the gulf widened between the families begging for deeper pursuit, and the system that seemed eager to wrap a bow around the easiest suspect. That gulf would haunt Florence for years. You've seen this before, haven't you? A headline, a name, an easy motive, and everyone rushes to believe. But what happens when the evidence disagrees? What happens when the wrong person carries the weight of suspicion, while the real predator slips deeper into the night? That is the peril of cold cases. When stories harden too fast, truth evaporates. And years later, families are left to light candles by the river, wondering why the system insisted on the wrong villain. Ever seen police chase the wrong story? These cold case files prove why details matter. If this part of the story shakes you, stay with us, because what comes next shows just how much damage confirmation bias can do. The weeks after Ethan Cole's release carried the weight of exhaustion. The families clung to whatever strands remained. The Silverado, the Bronco, the waterlogged notebook. But in Florence, the case's momentum faltered. Search crews dwindled. Newspapers shifted to new headlines. The summer heat rolled on, oppressive, unrelenting. Then, in late 2009, 2 years after Jessica and Daniel vanished, a moment arrived that could have reshaped everything. Hunters walking the northern Florence woods stumbled upon a gray hoodie, crumpled beneath brush, its fabric stiff with dried blood stains on the sleeve. They reported it immediately. Police collected the garment, sealed it in an evidence bag, and murmurs rippled through the families. "This is it. This is the break we prayed for." Jessica's sister Amanda barely slept that night, staring at her phone for a call. Daniel's father walked circles in his yard, whispering to himself that this time the truth would surface. But the truth never came. Weeks passed, and when the families pressed investigators, the answer was delivered flatly, bureaucratically. The hoodie had gone missing. An administrative error, the report claimed. A misplaced evidence tag, a file that didn't match. Nothing sinister, they assured. Just paperwork. But the phrase administrative error was gasoline on a fire. Amanda Monroe, her hands shaking, stood before local reporters. A blood-stained hoodie doesn't just vanish. Evidence doesn't evaporate. Someone is hiding something. Her eyes were wide, her voice cracking but sharp, as though she were pleading with the entire town. Daniel's father thundered in community meetings, his voice breaking with rage. "They tell me my son's blood is an error? My God, how do you lose blood?" And the community began to fracture. You begin to understand why families light candles, because switches are the only thing they can keep on. They cannot control a police file, or a vanishing hoodie, or the silence of officials. But they can control a flame, small and steady, and keep it alive against the dark. That year, Florence saw its first candlelight vigil for Jessica and Daniel. Residents gathered along the Tennessee River, holding small white candles, their flames flickering against the July wind. Photographs of the missing teens sat on a wooden table. The water reflected light like a trembling promise that they would not be forgotten. But beneath the solemn glow lay something more corrosive. Psychologists call it moral injury, the wound that occurs when people feel betrayed by those meant to protect them. Soldiers feel it when leaders abandon them. Victims feel it when institutions look the other way. And in Florence, moral injury spread quietly, like cracks running through glass. Neighbors whispered that maybe someone inside the department had a reason to bury evidence. Rumors grew about connections, pressure, or incompetence too shameful to admit. Whatever the cause, the effect was devastating. Trust collapsed. At grocery stores, residents asked each other in hushed voices, if they can lose a hoodie, what else can they lose? In barber shops and gas stations, people muttered that maybe justice wasn't blind, it was asleep. The Monroe family felt it most brutally. Jessica's mother carried the weight like lead in her chest. She found herself unable to enter the police station without trembling. Every time she walked past an officer at the farmer's market, her throat tightened, her body remembering the words, administrative error. Daniel's family, once steady pillars in their church, began sitting in the back pews, silent during sermons, their faith strained not only in God, but in the very fabric of community order. Florence itself bore the bruise. Candlelight vigils grew larger, but so did the bitterness beneath them. The glow of remembrance doubled as an accusation. We remember, even if you have chosen to forget. The missing hoodie became a ghost story. Children whispered it walking home from school. Adults brought it up at town halls. No one could prove where it had gone, but everyone knew what it symbolized. Negligence, betrayal, the collapse of faith in a system sworn to protect. Moral injury does not heal easily. Once trust is broken, every action becomes suspect. When police later announced routine updates, families heard indifference. When detectives spoke of limited leads, the community heard excuses. The silence of officials became as loud as the Silverado's still blaring radio that first night. And in that silence, Amanda Monroe refused to let the flame die. She studied law books late at night, printed public records, filed requests under Alabama's sunshine laws. Her bulletin board filled with notes, pins, photographs. While others whispered rumors, Amanda built resolve. She would not let her sister become a file lost in a dusty cabinet. But the weight on her shoulders was brutal. Neighbors sometimes called her obsessed. Reporters treated her like a sideshow. And yet, moral injury is not only pain, it can be fuel. Betrayal becomes determination. The hoodie that vanished did more than deepen mistrust. It sharpened Amanda's resolve into steel. Meanwhile, Florence drifted further into shadow. The police quietly downgraded the case. By 2010, the official word was clear. No concrete leads. The case, once pulsing with urgency, froze. It was labeled a cold case. For Jessica's mother, that label was unbearable. She collapsed on her living room floor the night she heard it, clutching her daughter's photo as though the frame itself might answer back. Daniel's father, weary and hollow, retreated into silence. The families had entered a new kind of torment, not the frenzy of searching, but the long, suffocating weight of waiting. And Florence, as a whole, carried the wound. The moral injury of a vanishing hoodie, of silence from authority, of evidence mishandled and excused, became the town's inheritance. It festered in every whispered rumor, every sideways glance at the courthouse. You picture it now. Candles flickering by the river, families clinging to each other while officials look away. The question gnaws at you: if evidence can vanish into thin air, what else has been erased? And if the system falters, who is left to fight? The fight, it turned out, would fall on Amanda Monroe. Alone, but unyielding. Have you seen evidence mishandled? Share your story, because public memory keeps these cold case files alive. And the more we speak, the harder it is for truth to disappear. The case was cold, but Amanda Monroe refused to let it freeze completely. While others in Florence grew weary of unanswered questions, Amanda transformed her grief into determination. At just 24, she began teaching herself the language of investigators. She checked out books on forensic science from the county library, pored over online articles about blood spatter analysis, chain of custody, and DNA preservation. While her peers were finishing college or starting careers, Amanda spent evenings hunched over notebooks, copying definitions and sketching crude diagrams of evidence bags. Her desk became a war zone of papers, highlighters, and photographs of Jessica and Daniel. She mailed letters to the Florence Police Department once a month. Some were polite inquiries, others sharpened into fiery demands. Where is the missing hoodie? Why has the Bronco lead been buried? Each letter was stamped, sent, and logged on her bulletin board. Officers rarely replied. When they did, the responses were clipped, bureaucratic, but the act of writing was its own defiance. You pin another note on the board and feel the room tilt a degree toward truth. It isn't proof, not yet, but every line of ink, every push against silence, makes the walls of indifference a little thinner. Amanda also embraced the growing power of the internet. In 2011, she launched a Facebook page titled Justice for Jessica and Daniel. At first, it drew only relatives and a few classmates. But as months passed, strangers joined, people who had lost children, amateur sleuths fascinated by mysteries, reporters hungry for quotes. The page grew into a small but determined community. Members shared newspaper clippings, old photos, theories about the Bronco, and questions about the vanished hoodie. Amanda moderated tirelessly. She deleted gossip, demanded respect, and posted updates with an almost journalistic precision. She wasn't just Jessica's sister anymore. She was becoming the custodian of their memory. This transformation is what psychologists call survivor activism. When systems fail, survivors of tragedy often carry the torch themselves. The pain of loss becomes fuel, reshaping grief into action. Survivor activism is never clean. It is born from insomnia, nightmares, and anger that corrodes the body. But it also turns powerlessness into a form of resistance. In Florence, Amanda's activism unsettled some. Old acquaintances whispered that she was obsessed, that she couldn't let go. At church, a few avoided her gaze, afraid she would hand them a flyer or ask for donations. But survivor activism is rarely comfortable for the activist or for the community forced to confront what it would rather forget. Every July 14th, Amanda organized candlelight vigils by the Tennessee River. Where once her parents had led in broken voices, now Amanda stood at the center, steady, demanding. She spoke not of despair, but of duty. Justice doesn't disappear just because a file is closed, she told the crowd, her words carried over the water by the wind. The vigils grew, attracting reporters and even TV crews from Birmingham and Nashville. Each flame lit in the dark became a reminder that the case, however old, still breathed. Behind the public resolve, Amanda's private life frayed. She had moved into a small apartment in Birmingham to escape the stares in Florence. Nights were spent scrolling through cold case forums, reaching out to retired detectives, asking strangers for advice on how to request evidence audits. Her refrigerator often stood half empty. Her job a string of part-time roles that left just enough money for rent and stamps. Still, she pressed forward. Every unanswered email, every voicemail never returned by detectives, only hardened her. Survivor activism is lonely, but it also creates identity. Amanda was no longer just Jessica's sister. She was the investigator of the silence itself. By 2012, her bulletin board was a patchwork of persistence. Newspaper headlines cut into strips, maps of Florence with colored pins marking search zones, a copy of the vague police note about the missing hoodie, circled in red, and taped at the center, a printout of a single anonymous email. Ask about the red Bronco. Eights. Amanda stared at that line often, mouthing the words like a mantra. If the authorities would not ask, she would. Her work began to attract allies. A retired journalist offered to mentor her on public records requests. A professor of criminal justice at the University of North Alabama reached out, intrigued by her methodical posts online. Through her persistence, Amanda created a new ecosystem of accountability, small, fragile, but real. And that ecosystem began to change the narrative. While Florence police still treated the case as closed, Amanda's online group kept it alive. Each new member meant another set of eyes watching the officials, another voice ready to question. Survivor activism spread the burden of memory, ensuring Jessica and Daniel's names didn't sink into the oblivion of unsolved cases. For Amanda, the price was steep. She aged faster than her years, her eyes carrying the sleepless shadows of someone who had lived too long in grief. Yet, in her resilience lay something undeniable: strength forged in loss. Survivor activism gave her purpose, even when hope seemed impossible. Florence may have wanted silence, but Amanda Monroe insisted on noise. She typed, mailed, posted, organized, argued. With every action, she carved a truth the town could no longer ignore. The cold case wasn't gone, it was waiting. And as she tacked another note to the board, string connecting photos and headlines into a web of persistence, the room seemed to tilt ever so slightly toward justice. In the fall of 2012, Amanda's persistence was rewarded, or so she thought. One night, while sorting through stacks of clippings and unanswered letters, her inbox chimed. The email bore no sender name, no signature, only 4 words. Eights. Ask about the red Bronco. Eights. The message pulsed like a heartbeat on her screen. The Bronco, the one lead that had evaporated years ago, smothered in silence. Amanda printed the note, taped it to her bulletin board, and circled it in red ink. Her hands trembled, her mind racing. Whoever sent it knew something. For months she pursued the trail. Late-night drives through abandoned lots. Inquiries with mechanics about old Broncos. Every dead end only fueled her. Then, in June 2015, the phone rang. A man's voice, gruff and urgent, said only, "The old warehouse off County Road 14. Go there." Before Amanda could respond, the line went dead. Fear and hope tangled in her chest. She called the Florence police, demanding they check the site. Officers, weary of her insistence, reluctantly agreed to accompany her. The warehouse loomed like a skeleton on the landscape, its tin roof rusted, doors sagging on broken hinges. Inside, dust swirled beneath flashlights, beams cutting through the stale air. Then one officer bent down, fingers brushing something metallic. A silver necklace, heart-shaped pendant, initials faintly scratched. Amanda gasped. It looked exactly like the one Jessica had worn during her senior year. For the first time in years, she felt the floor tilt toward truth. Tears welled as she whispered, "It's hers." Eights. News spread quickly. Headlines blared. New evidence found in Florence disappearance. TV vans crowded the warehouse gates. For Amanda, the necklace was more than jewelry. It was a lifeline. But the hope curdled fast. Forensic analysis revealed the small flecks of blood on the pendant weren't human. Pig's blood. The chain itself carried no DNA from Jessica or Daniel, and experts concluded it had been staged, planted deliberately. The Florence police chief, in a dismissive press conference, labeled it a cruel prank. He smirked at the cameras, declaring Amanda's pursuit a waste of resources. Eights. The backlash was brutal. Locals mocked Amanda on social media, accusing her of desperation, of manufacturing evidence to stay in the spotlight. Strangers left comments on the justice for Jessica and Daniel Page. Crazy sister chasing ghosts. Let them rest already. Eights. Amanda sat at her desk, staring at the pendant photo, hands numb. How had hope turned so quickly into humiliation? Imagine it's you. You've waited years, endured silence, clung to fragments. Then someone hands you what looks like salvation. You believe it, you breathe it. And then the experts strip it away, leaving you exposed. The floor beneath you doesn't just tilt, it drops. Psychologists have a term for this tactic: gaslighting. When someone deliberately manipulates perception, making victims doubt their own memory, their own reality. The necklace was not just fake evidence, it was an assault on Amanda's credibility. But more chilling than gaslighting is the possibility of planted evidence. Someone out there had access to a pendant resembling Jessica's, access to blood to make it look convincing, and the malice to stage it in an abandoned warehouse. Why? To humiliate Amanda? To derail her pursuit? Or to control the narrative, shaping the story so that truth would remain buried under layers of deception? Planted evidence isn't random. It requires knowledge, preparation, and intent. Whoever staged the necklace wanted Amanda to find it, wanted her to fall into the trap. And when the trap snapped shut, it discredited not only Amanda, but the case itself. For Florence, the warehouse incident became another nail in the coffin of belief. People who once stood with Amanda now rolled their eyes when her name was mentioned. Officials quietly filed her calls under obsessed relative. The case slid deeper into darkness, not because of a lack of clues, but because of too many, some real, some poisoned. And yet Amanda refused to break. Nights found her sitting in silence, the printed email still pinned to her board. Ask about the red Bronco. Whoever planted the necklace may have stolen her credibility, but the Bronco remained untouched in her mind. That anonymous message was different. It wasn't meant to humiliate. It was meant to point. Gaslighting thrives when victims retreat. But Amanda leaned in. She kept posting updates. She kept filing letters. And though the community mocked, the warehouse incident also drew new attention from cold case enthusiasts across the country. On online forums, strangers debated. Who had the resources to plant such evidence? Why pig's blood? Why now, years later? The warehouse clue didn't solve the case, but it reshaped Amanda. She realized she was no longer fighting only for Jessica and Daniel. She was fighting against a shadow willing to warp reality itself. And you can feel it too, the sense that someone, somewhere, is writing the story for you, placing props on the stage, daring you to believe them. What do? Do you step back, or do you push forward, knowing every planted clue carries the risk of collapse? Amanda pushed forward, but the years ahead would test her more brutally than she imagined. If a planted clue landed in your lap, Would you publish it or hold it back? Comment your move below. Because these cold case files remind us, sometimes the lies are laid out more carefully than the truth. By the fall of 2019, Florence had grown numb. The case had become background noise, another unsolved story layered with gossip, faded headlines, and too many unanswered questions. Even Amanda, hardened by years of ridicule and persistence, began to wonder if justice would ever stir again. Then, one gray morning outside Killen, about 10 miles from Florence, a logger's shovel struck metal beneath an old oak tree. At first, he thought it was scrap, another relic rusting in the soil. But when he pulled it free, mud clinging to every edge, he realized the box had once been locked, though the latch was broken. His curiosity overruled hesitation. He pried it open and froze. Inside, wrapped in damp cloth, lay fragments of a vanished world. A wristwatch, its leather strap cracked, the initials DW etched faintly on the back. A torn concert ticket stub, the date still visible. July 14th, 2007. And most haunting of all, a Polaroid photograph of Jessica Monroe, smiling into a crowd, unaware that the lens capturing her joy was the same lens sealing her final hours. The logger's hands trembled as he phoned authorities. By the time officers arrived, news had already spread. Soon the metal box sat under bright forensic lights, sealed in plastic, guarded as though it were sacred. For Amanda, seeing the photograph on a local broadcast was like being struck by lightning and soothed in the same instant. She clutched her chest, whispering, "It's her. It's really her." After 12 years of silence, a trace had finally broken through the soil. And you feel it too, the first cold certainty. Molecules don't forget. Time may fade witnesses, erode trust, even bury objects under oak roots, but touch DNA clings like a whisper. It remembers. Forensic technicians set to work. They swabbed the watch strap, scraped particles from the ticket, and examined the Polaroid for latent prints. What they uncovered would tilt the entire case. On the surface of the box, embedded in sweat and residue, they identified a DNA profile. The match was clear, undeniable. It belonged to Caleb Johnson, a local mechanic, now in his 30s, once the quiet owner of a red Ford Bronco. The Bronco. The same vehicle whispered about in 2007, briefly noted in witness statements, then scrubbed from reports. The revelation jolted Florence awake. Forensic certainty carried a weight gossip never could. A name, once dismissed, now resurfaced with molecular proof. To understand why this mattered so much, it helps to see the science through simple eyes. Forensics 1-1. 8. DNA is like a biological fingerprint, unique to every individual. When you touch an object, a watch strap, a metal surface, even a ticket stub, tiny fragments of your cells transfer. Skin cells, sweat, microscopic traces invisible to the naked eye. This is called touch DNA. Forensic teams carefully collect these traces, swabbing surfaces, sealing samples in sterile tubes. Then, in the lab, technicians amplify the DNA using a process called PCR, polymerase chain reaction, creating enough material to compare against known profiles. The odds of a false match are astronomically low, sometimes less than 1 in a billion. In Caleb Johnson's case, his DNA wasn't just similar. It was exact. The profile matched law enforcement databases from prior records. It meant that, at some point, his hands had touched the box that contained Jessica and Daniel's belongings. Skeptics sometimes ask, couldn't DNA transfer by accident? Yes, but chain of custody is what strengthens the conclusion. Chain of custody is the meticulous record of every step evidence takes, from discovery to collection, from bagging to storage. If handled correctly, there's no confusion. The DNA didn't appear out of nowhere. It was there because Caleb had been there. Even more damning, forensic specialists discovered a single hair tangled in the worn strap of Daniel's watch. Under the microscope, its root yielded enough genetic material for comparison. The result: Caleb Johnson again. These weren't rumors. These weren't recanted witness statements. This was the science of presence. For Amanda, the result struck like both vindication and heartbreak. She had endured gaslighting, planted evidence, laughter at her expense, and now, finally, the system could no longer deny what she had known in her gut. Someone had stalked her sister, someone had buried the truth, and his name was Caleb Johnson. The Florence community reacted with shock. Some cursed the lost years, wondering why Caleb hadn't been pursued in 2007 when witnesses first mentioned his Bronco. Others muttered about connections, his father's ties in local industry, the possibility of influence shielding him. Whatever the reason, the scientific proof now outshone the excuses. You think back to the beginning. An empty Silverado, a folded map, a shoe, a smear of blood. Back then, everything was noise. But now, under the oak tree, the noise turned into signal. The molecules spoke. And molecules, unlike memory, don't lie. The discovery also reignited the moral injury Florence had carried. Residents demanded answers. Why had this clue taken 12 years to surface? Why was Caleb's name not pursued harder from the start? The oak tree hadn't just revealed evidence. It revealed negligence, even betrayal. But for Amanda, the box meant something more intimate. It was a message from the past, buried but not lost. Jessica's Polaroid, Daniel's watch, the ticket stub, all artifacts of a night stolen. For years, she had carried the burden of keeping their story alive. Now the earth itself had delivered proof that her fight was not in vain. And as the forensic report circulated, the narrative shifted. Caleb Johnson was no longer just a name on a forgotten page. He was the molecular shadow tied to Jessica and Daniel's final night. Justice, delayed though it was, had begun to stir. The courtroom was hushed when the verdict was read. Caleb Johnson, once the nameless shadow behind a red Bronco, now stood condemned under the weight of 12 years of evidence. Guilty on 2 counts of first-degree murder. The sentence? Life without parole. The gavel fell, and with it, a chapter of silence closed. For Amanda Monroe, the words echoed through every sleepless night, every unanswered letter, every cruel headline that had branded her desperate. She sat still, clutching her mother's hand, her chest rising and falling with the slow rhythm of release. Justice had arrived late, fractured and scarred, but it had arrived. That evening, Amanda carried a single candle to the banks of the Tennessee River, where years of vigils had flickered in defiance of the dark. She lit the wick and set it on the water. The flame drifted across the current, its reflection quivering like memory itself. Her words were soft, carried by the breeze. Justice came late, but it came. And it came because we never stopped speaking. Eights. Others gathered beside her, families, neighbors, strangers who had followed the case. They lit candles of their own, sending small suns across the river's surface. For the first time, Amanda felt the weight lift, not gone, never gone, but lightened by truth finally spoken aloud in a court of law. The Tennessee River had seen the silence. Now it bore witness to light. This was the lesson Florence carried forward. Justice may stall, stumble, even vanish under bureaucracy and betrayal, but it cannot be buried forever. Truth waits, hidden in molecules, in memories, in the roots of old oak trees. And when it surfaces, it speaks louder than the lies that tried to erase it. Amanda turned from the river, her candle still glowing in the distance. She knew the fight was not only for her sister and Daniel, but for every family whose case sat frozen in a file cabinet. Every voice mattered. Every story deserved daylight. Subscribe and drop a case you want us to cover, because every voice helps bring cold case files back into daylight.